The educational interstellar vessel, the Voyager's Quill, glided silently through the void, its course set for the Sol system. Inside the ship's luxurious learning chamber, Professor Vylorn stood before his small class of diverse students. The Xylosian academic cut, an imposing figure with his rigid posture and 6 articulated limbs that moved with precise, calculated gestures as he spoke. His exoskeleton gleamed under the chamber's soft lighting, and his compound eyes reflected the holographic images of Earth that rotated slowly above the central learning table. As you can see, Professor Vylorn's voice resonated with the dry, measured tone of someone who had given this lecture hundreds of times. We will be entering Earth's orbit in approximately 36 galactic standard hours. I trust you have all completed the preliminary readings on this interesting planet. The 4 students exchanged glances, each representing a different species from across the Galactic Alliance. Xyler, a silicon-based Krillian whose crystalline body refracted light in muted blues and purples, raised a hesitant appendage. Professor, I've been reviewing the historical data, and I'm somewhat confused by Earth classification as a death world. The gravitational pull is well within tolerable parameters for most species, and while the atmospheric composition is oxygen-rich, our suits should compensate adequately. A valid observation, Professor Vylorn acknowledged with a slow blink of his compound eyes. Perhaps others would care to comment? Lyra, an Aquarian with iridescent scales and webbed digits, shifted in her hydration chair. Water circulated through transparent tubes that kept her skin moisturized in the ship's dry atmosphere. I believe the classification is primarily historical hyperbole, she said with unmistakable confidence. Earth was discovered during the early expansion era when safety protocols were less stringent. Contemporary xenobiologists have suggested reclassifying it as a moderate challenge world at most. Thar, a hulking chak with armored plates covering his muscular frame, let out a rumbling laugh that vibrated the learning table. This field trip will be a pleasant vacation compared to the training grounds on my homeworld. My ancestors evolved in a gravity, 30% stronger than galactic standard. Earth will feel like floating. The 4th student, Alara, a slender Psionian with pale, almost translucent skin and large, dark eyes that seemed to see beyond physical reality, remained silent. Unlike the others who had based their opinions on technical data, she had been studying cultural transmissions from Earth. Something about the chaotic emotional pattern she detected in Earth's broadcasts unsettled her, developing empathic abilities. I see you've all formed opinions based on the preliminary data, Professor Vylorn said, his mandibles clicking together in what the students had learned to recognize as mild amusement. That is predictable. Earth has become something of a curiosity in modern galactic studies, a living museum of primitive evolution or an odd tourist destination rather than a genuine threat. Precisely, Lyra interjected, her scales rippling with academic pride. The term Deathworld is clearly an exaggeration by early galactic historians. Professor Vylorn's compound eyes fixed on Lyra for an uncomfortable moment. Is it indeed? How fascinating that you've concluded this without having experienced the planet firsthand. His voice carried no inflection, yet somehow the words stung. The professor manipulated the control panel with 3 of his limbs simultaneously. Before we proceed further, I believe a practical demonstration is in order. The Voyager's Quill is currently passing through the Kuiper belt of the Sol system, approximately 40 astronomical units from Earth. At this distance, we can begin to feel the first, subtle influences of our destination. Without warning, the familiar hum of the artificial gravity generators diminished, then ceased entirely. The chamber's environment shifted almost imperceptibly. I have temporarily disabled our artificial gravity system, Professor Vylorn explained as he remained perfectly balanced on his 6 limbs. What you are experiencing now is merely the gravitational influence of the Sol system's star and outer planets, a fraction of what awaits us. The students adjusted to the change with varying degrees of success. Xyler's crystalline form trembled slightly as internal lattices realigned. Lyra's hydration tubes swayed in the altered field, causing her to grip her chair. Thar seemed unaffected, while Alara closed her eyes, seemingly sensing something beyond the physical change. "This is it?" Lyra asked, her confidence returning after the initial discomfort passed. "I was expecting something more dramatic. If this is the gravity shock that early reports warned about, then the classifications are even more exaggerated than I thought." Professor Vylorn did not respond immediately. He simply observed his students with an enigmatic expression, his mandibles curved in what might have been a smile. After a long moment, he reactivated the artificial gravity system. "We have several days before our arrival," he finally said. "I suggest you all review the more detailed accounts of previous expeditions. The historical archives contain first-hand reports that may prove more illuminating than the sanitized academic summaries." As the students filed out of the learning chamber, Professor Vylorn added almost casually, "And I would advise adjusting your personal gravity compensators to gradually increase pressure over the next cycle. Consider it." Preparation. The words lingered in the air like a premonition, planting the first seeds of unease in the minds of the previously confident students. 3 days later, the Voyager's quill established orbit around the blue-green planet. From this distance, Earth looked deceptively peaceful, a swirling marble of blue oceans and white cloud formations, with land masses in various shades of green and brown. The students gathered once again in the learning chamber, where Professor Vylorn waited with uncharacteristic stillness. Even his antennae remained motionless as he addressed them. "Today, you will experience Earth's gravity in its full, unmitigated form. The ship's buffers will be completely disabled, allowing you to feel precisely what has earned this planet its classification. Prepare yourselves." Xyler shifted nervously. "Professor, wouldn't a gradual introduction be more education through experience?" "Xyler," Professor Vylorn interrupted. "Some lessons cannot be properly conveyed through incremental exposure." With that, he entered a command sequence. A soft tone indicated the deactivation of the ship's gravitational buffers. The effect was immediate and devastating. Xyler collapsed to the floor, his crystalline structure emitting high-pitched frequencies of distress as microfractures formed along his outer layers. Lyra gasped as her internal organs seemed to pull downward, her hydration tubes straining against the sudden increase in pressure. Even Kthar, for all his previous bravado, hunched forward with a grunt. His breathing labored as his massive frame fought against Earth's unrelenting pull. Alara fared worst of all. Beyond the physical strain that painted her pale features with exertion, her empathic abilities amplified the collective shock and pain of her classmates, causing her to curl into a protective ball, eyes shut tight against the onslaught of sensations. Professor Vylorn, though clearly affected by the gravitational shift himself, moved with deliberate, practiced motions. "This," he announced, each word measured and precise, "is Earth's natural gravitational field, what humans classify as 1G. Notice how it affects different physiological systems." "Can't breathe properly," Kthar managed to growl, his pride dissolving under the relentless downward force. "Indeed," the professor continued, unmoved by their suffering. "Your respiratory system, evolved for a significantly lighter gravitational field, must now work considerably harder. Your circulatory system faces similar challenges. The blood in your veins, or equivalent fluids for those without blood, must now be pumped against greater resistance." Lyra attempted to reach for her personal data pad, but found the simple movement exhausting. "This can't be correct," she gasped. "The preliminary data suggested." "The data was accurate," Professor Vylorn stated. "Your interpretation was flawed. Numbers on a screen cannot convey the relentless, constant pressure that shapes every aspect of life on this planet." Over the next hour, the professor forced them to attempt basic movements around the chamber. Objects dropped from their hands, crashed to the floor with alarming force. The simple act of standing upright became an exercise in endurance. Walking felt like wading through dense liquid. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of torment, Professor Vylorn reactivated the gravitational buffers. The relief was immediate, though the memory of the crushing pressure lingered in aching muscles and strained joints. This was merely the first lesson. Professor Vylorn informed them as they recovered. Tomorrow, we descend to the surface to experience what truly makes Earth a death world. I suggest you rest and prepare your environmental suits. We will be landing at a location humans call the Altiplano, a high plateau in the Andes mountain range. It is considered one of the more hospitable regions for first-time visitors. The way he emphasized hospitable left them with little doubt that what awaited would be anything but. The shuttle's descent to Earth's surface the following day was an exercise in controlled terror. Violent wind currents buffeted the small craft, causing it to lurch. Unpredictably, Thar, who had boasted of combat drops on his homeworld, gripped his harness with white-knuckled intensity. Xyler's crystalline form vibrated at a frequency that indicated extreme stress, while Lyra's scales had lost their iridescent shimmer, turning a dull, anxious gray. The atmospheric turbulence is entirely normal, Professor Vylorn assured them with what seemed like perverse satisfaction. Earth's weather systems are notably chaotic compared to regulated worlds. What you're experiencing is, in fact, what humans would consider a relatively calm day. When the shuttle finally touched down on the high plateau, the students were already exhausted from the combination of gravity and the stressful descent. But as the external sensors displayed the conditions outside, Professor Vylorn announced, "Now we begin our true field study. Activate your environmental suits and prepare to disembark." The moment the shuttle door opened, they were assaulted by a blast of thin, frigid air that cut through their environmental suits with shocking efficiency. The wind howled across the barren plateau with enough force to nearly topple Xyler, whose lighter crystalline frame offered little resistance. Thar instinctively moved to stabilize the smaller student, his own massive form struggling against the gale. The air at this altitude contains approximately 60% of the oxygen found at sea level, Professor Vylorn explained, his voice calm in their communication systems. Combined with the gravity we experienced earlier, this creates a dual challenge for most non-native species. Move carefully and monitor your exertion levels. They had barely covered 50 meters from the shuttle when the weather conditions shifted dramatically. The sun emerged from behind fast-moving clouds, and the temperature rose with alarming speed. What had been biting cold moments before became scorching heat that threatened to overwhelm their suits' temperature regulation systems. Thermal variance, the professor noted clinically. Earth's thin atmosphere, particularly at high altitudes, allows for rapid temperature fluctuations that would be considered extreme emergencies on most regulated worlds. Here it is simply weather. Lyra, whose Aquarian physiology was particularly sensitive to sudden temperature changes, began to show signs of distress. Her scales flickered between defensive patterns as her suit struggled to maintain optimal hydration under the intense solar radiation. "Professor," she gasped, her earlier academic confidence completely evaporated. The environmental data didn't indicate such extreme conditions. "Average readings rarely capture extremes," Professor Vylorn replied. "A fundamental limitation of statistical analysis that many find inconvenient when confronted with reality." As if the planet itself were determined to prove his point, the horizon suddenly darkened. A wall of ominous clouds approached with unnatural speed, bringing with it a drop in temperature that the students could feel even through their environmental protection. "Weather front approaching," Professor Vylorn announced. "I suggest we take shelter behind those rock formations. Quickly now." They barely reached the modest protection of a rocky outcropping when the storm hit with full force. What had been merely strong wind became a howling gale, carrying particles of ice that struck their protective visors like miniature projectiles. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that their suits' external temperature displays struggled to keep pace. "This can't be normal," Xyler cried out, his crystalline voice fracturing with stress. No sentient species would evolve in such conditions. And yet, humans have inhabited this region for thousands of years, Professor Vylorn countered. Before modern technology, they survived these conditions with nothing more than insulated clothing and rudimentary shelters. Thar, who had positioned himself to shield Alara from the worst of the storm, growled in disbelief. Impossible! Even the warrior clans of Chak would consider these conditions challenging for extended deployment. Nevertheless, the professor insisted, humans not only survived but established civilizations in environments far more hostile than this. And this, students, is merely their planet's weather. We have not yet discussed the biological threats. As if summoned by his words, the storm abated as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving them in an eerie calm. The sun emerged once more, steam rising from the suddenly warming ground to create a misty landscape that seemed otherworldly. Back to the shuttle, Professor Vylorn ordered. This was merely a brief introduction to Earth's atmospheric temperament. Tomorrow, we will explore a different type of challenge. That night, aboard the relative safety of the Voyager's quill, the students gathered in the common area, their earlier confidence thoroughly shattered. Thar, whose species prided themselves on physical prowess, sat in uncharacteristic silence, mentally recalibrating his understanding of environmental extremes. Lyra's data pad remained untouched beside her as she stared vacantly, her scientific certainty replaced by unnerving doubt. Xyler approached Professor Vylorn, who was reviewing data at a corner terminal. Professor, the Krillian asked hesitantly, if the weather was that volatile in what you called a hospitable region, what other conditions exist on this planet? The professor's compound eyes shifted to focus on his student. Consider what you experienced today to be a mild introduction. Earth contains regions where temperatures regularly exceed the point at which protein denatures. Others where cold would shatter your crystalline structure in seconds. Areas where toxic gases vent naturally from the ground. In zones where radiation levels from natural elements would cause cellular damage to most galactic species within hours of exposure. Xyler's crystal matrix pulsed with anxiety frequencies. And humans inhabit these areas as well. They inhabit, explore, and in many cases seek out these extremes for what they term recreation, Professor Vylorn replied. Which brings us to tomorrow's field study, the biological dimension of Earth's classification. The rainforest engulfed them in a riot of green the moment they stepped off the shuttle. Unlike the barren plateau of the previous day, the Amazon basin assaulted their senses with overwhelming abundance. Thick, humid air laden with organic compounds, a cacophony of sound from countless unseen creatures, and vegetation so dense it seemed to consume the very light. The Amazon rainforest, Professor Vylorn announced, contains the highest concentration of biological diversity on the planet. Approximately 10% of Earth's known species exist in this ecosystem alone. Lyra, whose aquatic heritage gave her a greater appreciation for the moisture-rich environment, seemed to recover some of her scientific curiosity. The biodiversity readings are extraordinary, she noted, studying her scanner. The microbial concentration alone exceeds most terraformed worlds by several orders of magnitude. Indeed, the professor agreed. And every single organism here has evolved in a state of constant competition. This is not a garden, students, but a battlefield where chemical, biological, and physical warfare has been waged without cease for hundreds of millions of years. They proceeded carefully along a narrow trail, their environmental suits now configured for biological protection rather than weather extremes. The hot, humid air made movement even more taxing under Earth's gravity, causing their progress to be slow and deliberate. It wasn't long before they encountered the first of the forest's many defensive systems. Xyler, reaching to examine an attractive purple flower, recoiled with a cry of pain as microscopic barbs penetrated his protective glove. Fascinating, Professor Vylorn remarked, examining the plant from a safe distance. This species has evolved hollow silica hairs containing a neurotoxin that, in sufficient quantity, can cause respiratory paralysis in Earth mammals. Your crystalline structure fortunately makes you less vulnerable than others might be, though clearly not immune. As Xyler nursed his injured appendage, a high-pitched whine became audible near Alara's head. Before anyone could react, a small flying creature landed on her exposed neck and plunged a proboscis through her delicate skin. Mosquito, the professor identified calmly as Alara slapped at the insect in panic. One of Earth's most efficient disease vectors. That particular species can transmit several parasites that hijack neural systems in Earth organisms. Your psionian physiology is likely incompatible with the parasite's life cycle, but the introduction of foreign proteins may cause an immune response. Kthar moved to examine Alara's injury, but froze as a line of small, red-bodied creatures began climbing his leg. By the time he noticed their presence, several had already clamped powerful mandibles into his tough hide, secreting corrosive compounds that penetrated even his armored plates. Army ants, Professor Vylorn observed with academic detachment. Eusocial insects that function as a superorganism. They're capable of overwhelming creatures thousands of times their size through coordinated attacks. Most fascinating. Kthar frantically brushed the ants from his leg, his expression a mixture of pain and newfound respect. These creatures are weaponized to an extent that would violate treaty conventions in civilized space, he growled. That observation is more insightful than you may realize, the professor replied. Earth's evolutionary arms race has produced biological and chemical weapons that would indeed be banned in warfare between Galactic Alliance members. Yet here they are simply nature. As they continued their exploration, the threats became increasingly apparent. Spores from fungal growths caused Lyra's environmental systems to trigger multiple contamination alerts. Vines covered in microscopic hooks caught at their protective clothing. Even the mud beneath their feet contained parasites specifically evolved to penetrate skin and migrate through tissue. Professor Vylorn led them to a small clearing beside a slow-moving river. Take note of the water, he instructed. It appears peaceful, yet contains predators with feeding strategies that have remained essentially unchanged for millions of years. As if on cue, the surface of the river erupted as a massive scaled form lunged toward a monkey that had approached the water's edge. Jaws lined with conical teeth snapped shut with a sickening crunch, and the mammal disappeared beneath the surface in a swirl of crimson. Crocodilian, the professor noted, an ambush predator capable of generating bite force that would damage even Chak battle armor. They can remain motionless for hours, virtually undetectable until the moment of attack. The students watched in horrified fascination as ripples spread across the now calm surface, all evidence of the violent death already fading. Professor, Alara spoke for the first time that day, her voice tight with strain. I've been sensing something since we arrived. A kind of pressure, not physical, but the empathic environment. Professor Vylorn nodded. Earth's biosphere exists in a state of constant predation and defense. What you're sensing is the accumulated survival drive of billions of organisms, each fighting for its continued existence against endless threats. For a Psionian, it must be quite overwhelming. Alara nodded, her large eyes troubled. It feels primal, raw, like being surrounded by constant screams that never stop, yet somehow form a chorus. Their discussion was interrupted by a thunderous roar from somewhere deep in the forest, a sound so primally threatening that all four students instinctively moved closer together. Jaguar, Professor Vylorn identified, the apex predator of this region. Its hunting strategy involves crushing the skull of its prey between specialized teeth, penetrating directly into the brain to ensure immediate death. Why would evolution favor such excessive killing power? Lyra asked, her scientific curiosity momentarily overcoming her fear. In an environment where every organism is simultaneously predator and prey, where competition exists at every level from microbial to macroscopic, survival demands overwhelming force or perfect defense, the professor explained. There is no room for half measures on Earth. Each organism must excel at its survival strategy or face extinction. As they made their way back to the shuttle, Thar inadvertently brushed against a seemingly innocuous plant. Within seconds, his exposed skin erupted in angry welts as thousands of microscopic urticating hairs embedded themselves in his flesh. Even their plants possess active defense systems. He hissed through clenched teeth as Professor Vylorn applied a neutralizing compound to the affected area. Indeed, the professor agreed. What you've experienced over these 2 days represents merely the obvious threats, the ones large enough to observe or immediate enough to feel. We haven't addressed the viral and bacterial ecosystems that would render most off-world visitors severely ill or dead within days without medical intervention. Back aboard the Voyager's Quill, the mood was solemn as the students treated their various injuries and exposure symptoms. The physical challenges of Earth's gravity and weather had been difficult enough, but the biological warfare of the rainforest had introduced a new dimension of threat that none had fully appreciated from academic studies alone. Tomorrow, Professor Vylorn announced before dismissing them, we will observe the most dangerous aspect of Earth, the one that truly earns its Deathworld classification. We will study its dominant species from a safe distance. Humans? Xyler asked, his crystalline voice still vibrating with stress frequencies. After what we've seen of their planet, I'm not certain I wish to encounter them directly. A prudent concern, the professor acknowledged with what might have been approval. We will maintain observation protocols while studying behaviors that the preliminary data could not adequately convey. The following day found them hovering in a cloaked observation pod above a vast wilderness area that Professor Vylorn identified as a national park in the northwestern region of the North American continent. Below them, mountain ranges rose in majestic succession, their slopes covered in dense forests cut through by rushing rivers. The beauty was undeniable, but the students had learned to see beyond superficial appearances. This region contains multiple apex predators, the professor explained as he adjusted the observation equipment. Ursus arctos horribilis, the grizzly bear, capable of disemboweling prey with a single swipe of its clawed forelimb. Puma concolor, the mountain lion, an ambush predator that targets the spinal cord of its victims. Numerous venomous reptiles and arachnids whose toxins target neural or circulatory systems. The students nodded grimly, no longer surprised by Earth's arsenals of biological weapons. What did surprise them, however, was what the professor showed them next. "Observe," he directed, focusing their viewing screen on a narrow trail winding through the forest below. A group of humans moved along it, carrying only minimal equipment and chatting casually as they walked through what the students now recognized as a lethal environment. They're almost completely unprotected, Lyra noted with disbelief. Their skin is exposed to parasitic invasion. They have no apparent weapons for defense against predators, and their visual scanning appears limited to immediately obvious threats. Correct, Professor Vylorn confirmed. Now observe their safety equipment. He magnified the image to show a small canister attached to one human's belt. This contains a mild irritant spray effective only at close range against certain predators. It provides, at best, a few seconds of deterrence, assuming the human can deploy it before an attack occurs. Thar rumbled with confusion. This makes no tactical sense. On my world, entering territory controlled by apex predators would require at minimum a battle-grade exoskeleton and offensive weaponry. Yet these humans do so routinely, for what they term recreation, the professor noted. And this is far from their most perplexing behavior. Observe this different location. The viewing screen shifted to show a coastline where massive waves crashed against rocky formations. In the turbulent water, small figures moved atop artificial platforms. These humans are engaging in an activity called surfing, Professor Vylorn explained. The waters they have chosen are known hunting grounds for Carcharodon carcharias, the great white shark, a predator responsible for numerous human fatalities. The local authorities have posted warnings about recent shark activity in this precise area, and yet they voluntarily enter the predator's environment, Ilera whispered, her empathic abilities picking up not fear from the humans below, but exhilaration. They're enjoying the risk. Precisely, the professor confirmed. But this behavior extends beyond isolated risk-taking. Observe. The screen changed again to show a sheer cliff face where tiny human figures clung to the vertical surface with minimal equipment, slowly ascending hundreds of meters above certain depth. Free climbing, Professor Weilorn identified. A recreational activity where the human deliberately minimizes safety equipment to experience what they call pure interaction with the environment. Zeiler's crystalline structure vibrated with incomprehension. This defies all survival logic. No rational species would engage in such behavior. Your assessment follows conventional xenobiological models, the professor acknowledged, which is why Earth presents such a fascinating case study. But we've only observed isolated examples thus far. The truly illuminating behaviors are found in specific human regional variations. What followed was a carefully curated series of recordings that the professor had compiled from Earth's information networks. Each showed humans engaging in activities of such apparent recklessness that the students watched in stunned silence. A human deliberately jumping from an aircraft with nothing but a fabric canopy to slow their descent. Another human provoking a massive horned bovine to chase them through crowded streets. Humans willingly entering ring-shaped arenas to engage in physical combat for the entertainment of others. A particularly disturbing sequence showed a human attempting to handle venomous serpents as part of a religious ritual, receiving multiple bites, yet continuing the activity. But it was the final segment that truly shocked them, a compilation identified as Florida Man incidents, showing humans engaging in behavior so inexplicable, so seemingly divorced from any survival instinct, that even Cthulhu's warrior stoicism cracked. This cannot be representative of the species, he protested after watching a human attempt to capture an alligator using only a trash receptacle. No species capable of achieving spaceflight could possibly behave with such apparent insanity, Professor Weilorn suggested. And yet, these recordings are authentic. While the Florida Man phenomenon represents an outlier in frequency and intensity of such behaviors, the underlying pattern exists throughout human populations. Alara had closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the chaotic emotional signatures she detected even from recordings. There's something different about their fear response, she murmured. It's not absent, but it's entangled with something else. Something that pushes through the fear instead of being controlled by it. A most astute observation. The professor commended her. Human neurochemistry includes what they term an adrenaline response that can, in many individuals, create positive sensations during what should be pure stress situations. Some humans actively seek these sensations, becoming what their psychologists call adrenaline junkies. A physiological addiction to near-death experiences? Lyra asked incredulously. That's evolutionarily counterproductive. In most environments, yes, Professor Weilorn agreed. But on a death world like Earth, where threats exist at every scale from microscopic to planetary, such variation in risk response actually creates evolutionary advantages for the species as a whole. He manipulated the controls to show human settlements in extreme environments, the freezing poles, scorching deserts, storm-ravaged coastlines, and even temporary habitations on the slopes of active volcanoes. Humans not only survive in their death world, they actively explore and expand into its most hostile regions. Their capacity to assess, accept, and even seek out risks that would paralyze most rational species with fear has allowed them to adapt to environments that, by all conventional models, should be uninhabitable. The students sat in silence, attempting to process the implications. Thar was the first to speak. Among my people, we have a concept called battle madness, a state where a warrior disregards personal safety to achieve victory. It is rare and considered both valuable and dangerous. These humans seem to exist in a perpetual state of potential battle madness. An apt comparison, the professor nodded. Now, perhaps you begin to understand why the Galactic Alliance approaches Earth with such caution despite their relatively primitive technology. Any species that evolves on a death world does not merely survive its environment, it is forged by it. As the Voyager's quill broke Earth orbit and began its journey home, an unusual silence pervaded the vessel. The students, normally eager to dissect and analyze their field study experiences, instead found themselves lost in private reflection. Their understanding of life in the universe fundamentally altered. Professor Vylorn called them together for a final discussion session before they would begin preparing their individual reports. He noted with satisfaction that none displayed the casual confidence or academic detachment they had shown at the journey's beginning. Before we conclude this field study, he began, I would like each of you to share your primary insight from our experience with Earth. Xyler, let us begin with you. The Krillian's crystalline form pulsed with thoughtful frequencies before he spoke. I have been contemplating the relationship between environmental pressure and adaptation. What I previously considered to be theoretical extremes of adaptation are, in fact, baseline requirements for survival on Earth. The resilience of life there exceeds our standard models by several orders of magnitude. An excellent observation. Professor Vylor nodded. Lyra, the Aquarian had lost all traces of her previous academic arrogance. Her scales, once bright with confidence, now shifted in contemplative patterns. My understanding of statistical analysis has been recalibrated, she admitted. The average conditions we study in xenobiology fail to capture the true nature of a world like Earth. It is not the means that shape life there, but the extremes, the outliers that our models typically discount as anomalies. Indeed, the professor agreed. Thar, the massive Chak shifted uncomfortably. Among my people, we have a saying, know the strength of your enemy to know your own weakness. I believed I understood physical resilience and combat adaptation. I was mistaken. The casual disregard for death displayed by humans would be considered either insanity or the highest form of courage among Chak warriors. I find myself unsettled by the implications. A most honest assessment, Professor Vylorn acknowledged. And finally, Alara, the Psionian had been unusually quiet since their return. Her large eyes regarded the professor for a moment before she spoke. Earth feels alive in a way I've never experienced. Not just the organisms, but the world itself, a chaotic, swirling energy that flows through everything there. The humans don't just survive this chaos. They're part of it, shaped by it, embracing it. I sensed in them both destruction and creation existing simultaneously, neither winning, both necessary. She paused. I believe I now understand why the earliest contact reports described Earth not just as dangerous, but as fundamentally other. Professor. Vylorn's compound eyes seemed to gleam with approval. You have all identified critical aspects of what makes Earth unique in our known galaxy. It is not merely the gravity, the weather, the biological warfare, or even the psychological adaptations of its dominant species. It is the combination of all these factors creating an evolutionary crucible unlike any other we have studied. He activated a holographic display showing Earth once more, that deceptively peaceful blue sphere. The official Galactic Alliance classification of Earth as a death world is not, as some of you initially believed, an exaggeration or a historical artifact. If anything, it is a diplomatic understatement. The complete data on Earth's conditions and the psychological profile of humans are restricted to prevent unnecessary panic among certain Alliance members. This revelation brought startled reactions from all 4 students. The humans themselves remain largely unaware of how their homeworld and their own psychology are perceived by the wider galactic community. Professor Vylorn continued. Their natural assumption is that their experiences are universal, that all life faces similar challenges and develops similar responses. This misconception actually serves galactic diplomacy by preventing humans from fully realizing the advantage their death world evolution gives them. Advantage? Thar rumbled questioningly. Consider, the professor replied, a species that considers conditions lethal to most galactic life forms to be merely inconvenient. A species that routinely seeks out danger for pleasure. A species whose members will face near certain death if they believe their cause justifies the risk. His mandibles clicked softly. While humans remain technologically primitive compared to the Alliance, their potential as either allies or adversaries cannot be calculated by standard metrics. As the students digested this disturbing insight, Professor Vylorn made a final observation. You will each write comprehensive reports on your experiences, of course. But the most valuable outcome of this field study cannot be quantified in academic terms. You have gained perspective that most galactic citizens lack, direct experience with a death world and its products. That perspective will serve you well as humans continue their inevitable expansion into the wider galaxy. The Voyager's quill accelerated away from the Sol system, the blue planet receding to a mere point of light on their viewing screens. But for the 4 students who had briefly experienced its reality, Earth would never again be just another data point in a catalog of worlds. They had felt its crushing gravity, endured its chaotic weather, faced its biological arsenal, and most disturbingly, glimpsed the psychology of a species shaped by such forces. As the ship entered hyperspace, Professor Vylorn permitted himself a small, satisfied gesture, the equivalent of a smile in his species. The lesson had been successfully delivered. These students would never again underestimate a death world or its inhabitants. More importantly, they would carry this understanding into their various fields, helping to prepare the Galactic Alliance for increased contact with the unusual species that called Earth home. In her private quarters, Ilara recorded a final personal note to accompany her official report. Earth is not merely a planet with dangerous features. It is danger itself, given form, a crucible of evolutionary pressure that produces life fundamentally different from what we know elsewhere. Its classification as a death world is not a warning about the planet. It is a warning about what such a planet creates. I began this journey seeking to understand an academic classification. I end it with a profound realization. Some knowledge cannot be conveyed through data or language. It must be experienced to be truly understood. I now understand why Earth is called a death world, and I will never see the universe the same way again.